Hello, everyone. My name's Simon Bingham. I'm here presenting on regulatory best practices, looking at the target audience of environmental ministries and environmental regulators. So a little bit about myself. I've been a regulator for over 30 years, based in the United Kingdom. I'm still currently an environmental regulator working for the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. I've worked in a variety of areas, from inspection, permitting, as a specialist implementer of new legislation covering waste, water, integrated regulation, and radioactive substances. I've also managed a unit looking at the development of systems covering permitting, risk assessment, inspection frequency, and compliance. I've been working in the internationally for almost 20 years as a project executive and project manager of a variety of technical projects covering introduction of new technology like drones to regulation, or climate emergency, and embedding that into regulation. So my specialty, I guess, if I had to say I had one, was I'm into institutional capacity building, and I've been on the board of Impel, which is the EU network for the implementation and enforcement of environmental law, and an expert team leader of one of their groups, a cross-cutting expert team group, for 9 years. Okay. So the topics that we're going to cover are three principal areas. One, looking at good legislation, organizational design, and the regulatory cycle. The second, looking at regulatory strategy, resourcing of an organization, and strategic alignment, of which I'll say more specifically about what that actually is later. And the third area is what I've called permissioning. This could be permitting, licensing, or authorizing. It's all effectively the same thing, but we often use different words to describe it. I'm calling it permissioning, which is granting permission to either discharge something or emit something to the environment, or take resource from the environment. So a quick look at the first topic on good legislation, organizational design, and the regulatory cycle. Compliance assurance starts with having good legislation, and that's also feeds through into the design of your delivery organizations in terms of inspection and permitting, and how you implement the regulatory cycle within your organization and country. So the starting point is good legislation, and for what and what we'd also add into that is good policies, be it at a kind of ministerial level or even operational level. And for there to be good legislation, there has to be meaningful consultation in the process of drafting that legislation or drafting that policy. And what we mean by meaningful consultation is an open consultation that allows the maximum number of people and organizations to participate, but also listening to what they have to say. So we would include in the list of people to consult with the site operators themselves that will be impacted by the legislation, the trade associations that group together those those operators. NGOs, environmental, civil society type organizations, wider general public. Some individuals will have very clear thoughts on different topics. The regulators themselves, they have a very clear opinion on legislation and how it will operate once they start implementing it, but also other public bodies that the regulators perhaps will work with. It's, I think, useful to say that there's no single model of implementation. So um, what I would say is that there's no EU model of implementation, but if you look wider than that, there is no global model of implementation. Every organization, every country does it slightly differently. Um, Unfortunately, there's no manual of how to be a good regulator, and a lot of what we learn is based on experience of what works well and what doesn't work well. So on an EU context, the directive will be drafted and then shared amongst the EU member countries. After that, how it's implemented will be different in each country to a certain extent. And that's based on things like geography, legal history, the organizational design that's already there. But we'll cover some more of this in a minute. So one of the things I often see in legislation is a degree of prescription in the legislation. And sometimes there is a need to be flexible, and sometimes there's a need to be precise. And I'll give you an example. Having the actual powers of entry, for instance, for inspectors, clearly written in legislation is really good. That's a very prescriptive way of doing things. Having individual risk criteria of how you would choose an inspection is not so clever, because it doesn't allow you the flexibility of operational needs based on resources and emerging priorities. To get around something like that, where you want at a perhaps ministerial level a degree of control, it would be better to say that risk criteria are approved by the ministry or the minister, rather than dictate what those criteria are in legislation. It's useful that from the outset, mechanisms are embedded within the legislation to keep it up to date, keep it live, keep it meaningful. So what we often see is fine levels or charging levels embedded in the legislation, but they're set at the time the legislation was set, and over time they've become devalued. A fine will no longer have a deterrence effect. The charging amount will no longer cover the activity. So having some degree of index linking to ensure that those values remain current is very important. The next bit is having a valuable feedback loop. So once the legislation or policy is delivered and enacted, then the regulators have to start using that legislation. And there should be an opportunity to feed back to ministries that things are working well or not working well, and where required that amendments are made to that legislation so that it remains current. It's best if those amendments can be made in a codified manner, such that the legislation does not get lots of different individual sets of amendments. It becomes one clear body of legislation that non-legislators can still understand. So I'm going to talk a little bit about organizational design and what the institution actually does. Um, so I'm using a UK example here. Um, there are four nations within the UK: Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England. And the environment is devolved to local government. This means that the legislation is delivered at the local government level. So it's drafted at local government level. And so in the UK context, you can have um, what was formerly a directive coming into the UK, implemented in four slightly different ways. There's other examples of this in Europe. So, for instance, in Germany, the 16 Länder each implement their own legislation, environmental legislation, and in Belgium, the three regions also do their own legislation. So you're not necessarily getting a single coherent um, national approach in every member state or every country. Um, what the institution does is up to the individual country or region, and you will see that there is quite a strong variety of um, what's included within the institutional remit. So if I look at the UK, I look at the differences, you see that industrial regulation is on the list for all countries. And what I mean here is water, waste, air, and integrated regulation. Um, but each agency has a slightly different remit. Some have flooding, some have protected areas, and some have forestry. And again, there is no right or wrong answer to this. Um, so, in terms of what competency an organization has, I think that the principal requirements are that all required competencies are contained within some institution within the country. And that there's a requirement for a degree of institutional uh, monitoring and mapping to actually ensure that that takes place. Um, it's important to ensure the institution with the competency has the resource and capability to deliver their responsibilities. There's not a fixed amount of resource you need to be an environmental regulator. It's flexible and there are choices that have to be made. And we'll talk about some of those choices further in this presentation. Um, so, for instance, having nature and industrial regulation in the same in the same regulator has some benefits. It can lead to fully integrated environmental regulation, but it could also be seen as potential conflict of interest. For instance, when you have to permit an industry that may have an impact on a protected area. You said that there is no standard delivery model. And if I look at three examples, all of which joined the EU in May 2004, I think. So Estonia in the north, Poland and Slovenia. So they all joined the EU on the same date. But they all have very different designs. So Estonia has a single organization that does permitting and inspection. This used to be in two organizations, but they've recently combined them into a single environmental board. Poland has multiple organizations in terms of a central chief inspectorate, but regional permitting in the provinces and the voivodeships. And Slovenia has two national organizations, one central inspectorate and central permitting in the ministry. I would say on a EU context that actually having permitting or inspection in the ministry is now slightly unusual. There tends to be a degree of arm's length from um, from the regulator and the ministry. But there's no reason why this model shouldn't work. I think one of the principal things about the organizational design is the wiring that sits behind it. So having good communication between institutions or even departments within institutions is the most important. It's paramount. So permitters and inspectors need to talk. They need to be in contact almost constantly. Inspectors need to have access to permits. They need to be able to give feedback back to the permitters. There should be shared knowledge and intelligence shared between these institutions. If they have a computer system or database, having shared facilities or at least interfacing facilities is important. Ideally, having shared training and carrying out joint inspections would all be good practice in this area. So some member states have a very local delivery model with a national central organization that would normally the ministry, but sometimes an environmental organization underneath that would issue the legislation, but then it would be delivered at a local level. And that, for instance, Denmark would be a good example of that. The Netherlands and Sweden have certain aspects of that. And it's also the case that where there are national organizations, they will have many local offices that will also do the delivery. So, for instance, my own organisation, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, has 21 local delivery offices. So, with this spread out of delivery to a local or regional level, it's important to ensure that there's a degree of knowledge and capability that exists within that level. So, for instance, if you are devolving down to a local level and they only have, for instance, one power station in their area, they will have little experience in which they can compare the regulation of that power station to another similar power station, which makes it difficult to understand what level they should be able to achieve, what's practical, etc. So I think having support networks, training, and staff rotation to support local delivery is important. I mentioned common computer platforms, ICT platforms in the last slide. It's also very important at the local delivery level. It's also important to look at the practicalities of inspection and response. So if you have just a centralized delivery, for instance, Portugal, with one central office, you have to spend a lot of traveling to get to any incident or any inspection. On the flip side, if you live in the community where the big site that you regulate is the largest employer, it sometimes makes it difficult to actually get some of the improvements that you need made. So I think there's also a wider need to ensure that there's easy access to the institution for the general public, be that to access a permit or phone in or to pass on information about an environmental incident. So I think that can be done either through local office delivery or having systems in place to capture that request for information or delivery of information and then sharing of that more widely within the institution. So this looks at first glance a slightly messy diagram. It's a regulatory cycle. If I said it was highly simplified and there's lots of things under each level, it may actually become slightly worrisome. So we're looking at the regulatory process, and there's clearly legislation and policies that feed into permitting and the wider regulatory cycle. Um, I've said here that it's about risk-based regulation. And what I mean by that is there's choices at every level in terms of legislation, policies, permits, risk assessment in terms of how many inspections you will do, which sites you'll visit, what monitoring you'll do on a site, and how you assess it. That at every stage. Um, so the risk-based legislation will actually say what's regulated and what's not regulated. So higher risk activities should have a degree of regulation, low risk perhaps not. What's permitted and to the degree of that it's permitted will also be based on risk, with the highest risk activities requiring more complex permits. And equally, um, the more riskier an activity it is, that there should be more inspections and more monitoring on that activity. It's worth looking at the cycle because it is cyclical, and there are review steps that should come into this, so that the blue lines, blue circles, are for when there's compliance, and the red arrows are for when you get a degree of non-compliance. Um, so if everything goes according to plan, um, once you've got your legislation, the permits are carried out, you would do your risk assessment, which would determine inspection frequency. It's also important to say you don't have to inspect every site. Uh, there is the ability to say for low risk sites, we're not going to visit those. There's only certain bits of legislation that will actually make a prescriptive call on inspecting all sites. So in the EU, Industrial Emissions Directive is one of those sites, but lots of other bits of legislation like the Waste Framework Directive or the Water Framework Directive doesn't carry such prescription. So a little bit about regulatory strategy, resourcing, and strategic alignment. As I said, it's all about choices, and there is flexibility for every regulator about what they're going to prioritize and what they're going to do with their resource. So a good start is having a clear strategy that describes the role of the regulator, what their focus will be, what their approach to regulation is, and how they will work. Having this clearly set out informs the public and those that the regulator regulates know exactly what to expect. It's kind of like setting the stall out right at the very beginning. And within under this, what you can expect is inspection programs that will detail how many sites you're likely to inspect, what your focus will be in a particular year. This is the next level down from the strategy. A good resource here is a book by Malcolm Sparrow. He's a Harvard professor. He's a ex-UK policeman by training, but is a Harvard professor, and he's written a book called the Regulatory Craft. It's getting quite old now, but its contents are still very valid. He has other books as well that are quite useful. As I said, there's no handbook that we as regulators can turn to. So actually having some information that allow us to think about flexibility, and what we do is very important. So if I look at resourcing and how many people I need to regulate, I said there's no fixed prescriptive amount of staff that you need. It depends on what you do. The first is to understand that there are two fundamentals. There's I guess if you described it as known knowns, so you know, uh, for instance, how many permits you're likely to receive in a year. Not perhaps specifically, but you should have a good idea of how many permits you're going to get every year. You should, through your processes, know how long it should take to issue a permit. And as I said before, permit could be a license or an authorization. That they're all the same thing. By carrying out a risk assessment process, that tells you how many inspections you're going to carry out in a year. So your compliance monitoring, how many data returns you can expect will come from your permit. So again, you should have an idea of how many you should receive and how long it takes to assess those. All of those bits of information can give you some information in terms of resource needed for the organization. You would then do some compliance assessment work to pull various elements together, which informs you in terms of the future, what you're going to have to do. So that's the bluey green color. That's all planned. And what you find is there is more ad hoc work that comes from, for instance, the discovery of non-compliance through compliance monitoring, or the reporting of external environmental complaints, and also the response that you as a regulator do to non-compliance, such as enforcement or having to change a permit, etc. So the bluey green color, you know, to a fairly good level how much resource you need for that. For the red, you have to estimate based on previous years what that likely resource will be. It will change, it will fluctuate. So if you get a very large environmental incident at a big site, that will take a lot of resource. Significant resource, for instance, at a criminal level, will have an impact on available resource. But by taking the known and the estimated resource, you can have a good idea of how much resource you need to do that activity. That said, there are different models to regulate. So if we take the gray on the left, this is the resource that you have available. It's up to 100%. It doesn't matter if that's 100 staff or 1,000 staff. That's what you've got at the beginning. And what we see that is two principal differences. Those regulators that are purely in reactive mode, that they're spending most of their time, sometimes as much as 70%, on responding to complaints and non-compliances. It's not planned in, it's very ad hoc and reactive. The opposite side of that is an active deployment where you know which sites you're going to, you've got quite a good handle on compliance assurance, and you're able to do what your mission initially sets out to do by focusing on the planned resource side of the business. There's not necessarily a right and wrong model. That said, for environmental regulators, being on the active deployment side is much more, I, I guess, preferable, because it allows you, instead of just responding, to actually drive the agenda, to actually go after the highest risk sites, and to actually seek um, improvements, and to try and reduce overall pollution levels. I think probably from a reactive deployment model, where I've seen that best deployed is in the health and safety um, side of regulation, not in environmental. And one of the things that we see is in many new regulators, they're very much in that reactive mode. So I said earlier that I would talk about strategic alignment. Um, Strategic alignment is ensuring that you don't just do the activities in which you have direct responsibility for. So, for instance, if you were responsible for enacting the Industrial Emissions Directive, you don't just enact that and implement that, that you also take on board some of the wider policies and government priorities that have an impact on that. And if you can imagine a golden thread, as it were, that links these wider policies and government priorities all the way through the regulatory cycle, such that if, for instance, one of the priorities of government was reducing the impacts of climate change, that was embedded through the permitting process, if it could be, that in the compliance monitoring process during the inspections, you would be picking up on elements of that. That would perhaps be one of your uh, main focal points within an inspection, and that perhaps your enforcement policy was even tailored to having higher degrees of uh, severity of enforcement against some of those policies. It's all about choices, as I said, but that there's a element that we as environmental regulators have to pick up on some of these wider policies, and we are seen as the implementation mechanisms, but we're not necessarily told by ministry that it's something that we have to do. But we should be looking not just at our legislative framework, but also our policy framework to actually see what the principal focal point should be of our organizations. So topic 3 is permissioning. And with this permissioning, again, I'll mention it again, just it's about giving permission to carry out an activity or to take out a resource. There are certain principles that should be adhered to, I think. Having simple, clear, proportionate, outcome-focused, enforceable permits with a minimum number of conditions to achieve the universal outcomes. And those universal outcomes are prevention of harm, prevention of incidences or minimizing impacts, and the sustainable use of resource. So the outcome focus bit is the bit that is attempting to achieve those outcomes. So if we stick with those principles, and one of the reasons for stating them is because as permitters, one of the things we often do is put in a permit or a permission in a very tight legalese manner that's basically constructed in dense legal terms, trying to ensure every potential risk is covered. And this can be very difficult for many of those that we regulate to interpret and meet the needs of the permit, and therefore comply with the permit. So actually, if we start off with simple, clear, and proportionate and outcome focused, we are giving those that we regulate a chance of actually complying with what we want them to. So I said that the regulatory cycle diagram was obviously much more complex and than it actually showing, and this is a next level down. There are further detail beneath this, but at a high level, there's four uh, principal stages of a permission, a granting of permission. So the first is that the operator, the site operator, the company will carry out some initial planning, and they will look at what they want to do, uh, where they want to do it, and what permissions they need. Always remember that they will need permissions from many other environmental regulators, and environmental regulation is just one of a host of pieces of legislation that they need to ensure that they comply with. Best practice, certainly for larger activities, is pre-application discussion. So having face-to-face meetings with the operator and between the operator and the regulator to actually discuss what they intend to do, what you need them to do as a regulator, um, in terms of application, what level of abatement you would consider that they need for their activity. There's the permissioning process itself, the process of granting a license or issuing a registration. More on that in the coming slides. And then there should be a review process. So it depends from state to state, but some permits will have a fixed life term. So from anywhere from an annual requirement to get a new permit to once every 10, 15 years. And some will actually have no fixed term, and that they will go on in perpetuity forever. I think the ideal, certainly for larger sites, is to have a fixed term of about 8 to 12 years. This allows the operator to have a degree of knowledge that their conditions are likely to be fixed for a set period of time, which allows them to invest in their site and abatement level. If they have to change every 4 years, it makes it very difficult for them to plan ahead. I think for lower risk activities, having either a one-off activity permit where it's, for instance, move some waste from one area to another and use it for a specific purpose, that can be a fixed term activity, and once it's completed, the permission drops. The review process should also take into account that level of compliance. If the site operator can't comply with the permit and has a historic low compliance rate, then revocation of the permit may be the only answer if we can't gain compliance assurance by any other means. So there is a hierarchy within permissioning. It starts, well, there's four fundamental levels. The first is general binding rules. So these are rules that are in legislation. Um, there is they're fixed rules in legislation that people carrying out particular activity have to comply with. The regulator has no permit that they have to draft. The the operator doesn't have to tell anybody that they're going to carry out an activity. They just have to comply. Um, so a UK example, or certainly a Scottish example, would be how close you can plough a field to next to a river. Um, so the next level is a notification, and this is where again it is drafted in legislation what they have to do, but the operator has to notify the regulator that they're going to carry out that activity. The regulator can't say no. They just have to take the dot on the map that this activity is going to happen. The next level is what we call a registration. And it's again for a fixed activity, but the the regulator can say no to this activity if they think the operator can't fulfill the terms of the registration. The registration rules could be in legislation, or they could be in a fixed permit style set of conditions. And the top of the hierarchy is a permit. So if we look at in terms of environmental risk, the further you go up the pyramid, the higher the risk and the higher the complexity. And the lower you go down is there's an increase in frequency. So there'll be more activities, more people carrying out the same activity at general binding rule level than at permit. And there's a much higher degree of standardization of that activity as you go down the pyramid. So this one, we're just looking at that top bit of the previous hierarchy, permits. There are subdivisions within the permits. Again, it follows the higher risk, complexity, and the reducing frequency and standardization. But within permitting, there are two principal levels. One are kind of standard conditions where you're filling in the blanks. So, for instance, you're putting in specific amounts of pollutants into a condition, or you're putting in flow categories in terms of discharge. But those conditions are already known and standard. Um, the other option is what we call bespoke conditions. These are handcrafted for each permit. And it may be that some permits will have a mix of standard and bespoke. But if you've got a specific, unique activity, you're going to have to draft a permit just to cover that activity. The slightly complication here is that you could get permits that cover a single regime. So, for instance, just water. You may have bespoke permits or standard conditions permits for water, but you could also get them for integrated permits that cover uh, water, waste, air emissions, such like the Industrial Emissions Directive, or you can take it even further and include every environmental requirement that you would need on that site. And some of the Dutch permits are like that and would even cover things like tree cutting and tree pruning at a site level. In the hierarchy, you would expect that, as I said, there's higher risk activities at the top of the pyramid would require higher effort. This should be the standard model, and that the low risk activities require very little effort in inverse pyramid. So that's the diagram on the left. So high risk equals high effort, and lower risk equals lower effort. In reality, what we actually see is much more of a salt shaker kind of shape, where that we spend far too much as regulators, far too much time on low risk activities. We may not spend that much time individually, but by the sheer volume of them, we spend a lot of time. And the high risk sites, because they're often unique, we spend a lot of time on those as well. So um, more time perhaps than we're statutorily allowed, or just more time just trying to get them out of the door because they're so unique. So one of the biggest ways we can as regulators ensure that we reduce our effort is to look at specifically the process that we use to uh, issue the permits, but also mechanisms in which we can reduce the number and handling of low risk activities. So looking at efficient processing, or process efficiently, this is a model I've used for about probably 20 years, and it's called swim lane. So if you can imagine an Olympic swimming pool, and the numbers 1 to 8 are each a lane of that swimming pool, and they're each individual, so they're known names. If we then apply that to our organization and think that each individual in the permitting process is known and has a name, and their activity runs in a particular swim lane, we can map this out as an activity. And it's best to do this by actually taking the permit and physically following it through the organization, through every single step on its journey from coming in through the door as an application, or even earlier as a pre-application discussion, until it goes out of the door. And what we often find is that these permit applications will go to lots of different people for different tasks. And I've seen, even for a simple registration, so quite low down the hierarchy, 40 steps to issue a permit, to issue a registration. So each step, every time it moves from one lane to another lane, there is a delay. It sits on somebody's desk, and that it expands the length of time that it needs to get out of the door. It also increases the complexity and bureaucracy of the process. You've got lots of people doing little different steps. So the aim is to, when you review the process, is to see, one, can you delete steps? The next is, can you increase the number of steps that stay in one particular lane? So can lane 3 do the next 4 activities? Can you automate it so that it happens without touching a pair of human hands, or can you part automate it? And I think by actually looking at your process in this way, it very clearly maps out how complicated it is. Remember, each one of those positions in your authority is likely to be a different grade, and will have a different salary. And by understanding how long a permit application spends at each stage, you can work out how much it costs to issue a permit. And so that will give you an indication of, again, can you, if there is a charge for a permit, are you fully recovering your cost? If not, if the taxpayer is paying for the permit process, how much it is costing the taxpayer per permit. And the aim is to be as efficient as possible, as I said. So resource efficiency, there's two sides to this. Automate where possible, reduce the steps. That's the side on the right. So registrations and notifications especially can largely be automated. They can be done by ICT systems. But the other option is to use your legislation to push levels of authorization down. So instead of having a standard rules permit, can you do this through a registration process? And if you could do it that way, you can make the process cheaper. You can make the burden on the regulator and the site operator lower than it currently is, without necessarily having any detrimental environmental impact. You can just have conditions that are fixed in the registration to cover everything. A little bit about polluter pays. So we've got those levels of permission from general binding rules on the left hand side, notification, registration, then the simple and bespoke permits. And one of the best ways to ensure that the polluter pays principle is actually applied is by charging the site operator to carry out that activity. And there's two levels of charge. There's an application charge when they submit an application or submit a review or a substantial change. But there's also what we call a subsistence charge, which is carrying out yearly environmental monitoring. And there's different ways to look at this. So green means that you can levy a charge, or you're likely to be able to levy a charge for that activity. Amber means there's a possibility, and red means there's not. So if we look at the amber first, on the notification, most notifications will come with no requirement to pay a charge, but you could introduce a small levy to the site operator, the individual carrying out an activity, to carry out a charge. For a registration, there's an application charge, but because these are for a fixed time period, there's unlikely to be a subsistence charge. If you need to do an inspection, you would embed that as part of the application charge. And this is basically so the regulator, the state, recovers the cost of providing that permissioning activity rather than it lying on the general taxpayer of the state. Okay. A little bit about language and accessibility of the permits. So I've done work in a few countries recently where the language of the permission, the license, the permit is at a very high level. So, for instance, in some countries, it would be, I'll give you an example. I was in Africa recently, in a particular country. The main business language is English, of which 26% of the country speak. The main language in the countryside is Chichewa, of which 56% speak. It's the permits and permissions are all written in English. So the chances are, once you get beneath a significant level, that many people who receive a permit will not understand the requirements of the license. From a compliance assurance perspective, if you start with a license that they don't understand, then the likelihood of gaining compliance with that license is diminishing quickly. So here's an example I've taken from a license, and it's all about potential future modification of legislation, and basically means that if the legislation changes in the future, any requirements of that legislation are actually embedded within the permit. But actually, to say that is this really complicated sentence and structure that for somebody who isn't necessarily understanding or au fait with legal writing, it will make it difficult for them to understand what it's about. If you then take this license, this condition, and replicate it to 10, 20, 100 pages of conditions, it makes it very difficult to get to compliance assurance. So actually, for us as regulators, the challenge is to make our permissions accessible so that it can be complied with, but importantly, so that it's still enforceable. So using the language of the recipient whenever possible. And we know in many countries, there'll be multiple languages spoken. So actually, if we can issue licenses in the major languages, or if not able to issue a license, issue in a particular language, issuing accompanying guidance that says what compliance looks like in that language, that would be very beneficial and is seen as good practice. Using clear, concise, easy to understand language, again, is quite important. But explaining what the conditions are for and describing what compliance looks like. So as I said earlier on, that an operator will have to comply with many sets of legislation, many different permits, and for some, once they get that permit, that they feel that they can just go ahead and operate. They don't necessarily go back to what the conditions are. I've seen some regulators actually call in the operators specifically for larger sites, but for medium-sized sites as well, and they talk through the permit and what compliance looks like. I think that's certainly some of the best practice that I've seen in that area. So in terms of resource, doing the right things from Impel, that's the EU network for the enforcement and implementation of environmental law, which is an organization that has regulators from Iceland to Turkey, Finland to Portugal, and most of the countries in between. I think it currently has about 57 member organizations. Some of the guidance that they have developed is very useful for regulators, and one series is the doing the right things set of methodologies. So there's one on inspection, and there's one on permitting, and there's specific aspects on other bits of legislation as well. So they'd be really useful to actually look at the process in depth. So we've got our permit, and we're about to embark on ensuring compliance with that permit. And I guess for me, getting to the point of having the permit was almost the easy part. To actually get compliance, we have to understand that those that we regulate will have different behaviors, and we as regulators will have to use different responses to try and get them to comply. So this EU model looks at effectively good behavior on the left and bad behavior on the right, such that you have the compliant and those that go beyond compliance on the left, and those that carry out criminal activities on the right. So from the outset that this range of behavior is going to occur. It's like all of society. You get good people and bad people, and those that we regulate will fall somewhere in this spectrum. So we basically have to choose different options of how we will regulate them. So, for instance, if we were to issue a criminal penalty, such as a fine, a relatively small fine on the careless, they may change their ways. They may see this as going, okay, we need to be less. Be more careful to carry out this activity, and that way we won't get fined. If we were to use that small fine on a criminal, the first thing is they probably wouldn't pay it. But the second was they would continue on with their business model of criminality. So we basically have to change our responses. And I think that wider look at compliance assurance is the next stage of the journey. So we've started off with legislation, with resourcing and organizational design. We looked at regulatory cycle, and as far as the permitting to get us to actually deploy a meaningful permission to those that we regulate. That's what we've continued. That process we've continued through, and there's a lot of, as I said, good practices out there that we can share either through networks, through I guess presentations such as this, but we need to talk to each other. We need to have good communication between regulators. It's an interesting point that we, as environmental regulators, can learn regulatory tips and helpful and useful ideas from non-environmental regulators. So actually having good communication with our wider regulatory networks in our states is actually beneficial. And I think that is me. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, hopefully I'll see you again sometime.